performance is above expectations when they are informed of what is expected from them as early as possible. This is done by setting an objective right from the start, when students are aware of what they are going to achieve after finishing the program or course. In the same manner, teachers who understands and drives the lesson or the class to the desired learning outcome is most likely to align their instructional activities towards the learning objectives. So this yields higher learning percentage. Given this, all evaluation and assessment of learning activities should begin with a clear, concise, and achievable student learning outcome or SLO. This learning outcome will be the main backbone of your teaching strategy, and every strategy until your generalization should be based on this. Good day everyone. My name is Earl Jordas Guevara, and today we will be looking back on what we have learned on assessment of Learning 1, particularly on creating student learning outcomes. So here are the learning objectives for this topic. First, recall the general guidelines in writing students' learning outcomes. Second, articulate hierarchy of learning and Bloom's taxonomy. Since our education system shifted into student-centered approach of teaching and learning, it is important that we are aware about the OBE or the outcome-based education. This new perspective focuses on the skills and competencies that the students must demonstrate while they exit. From the word outcome-based, students will be expected to achieve specific learning outcomes at the end of every lesson or the subject itself. Here, they were aware of the goal that they need to achieve for the teaching and learning process to be successful. OBE has three characteristics. First, it is student-centered, where it centralizes the learning process for the learners by specifying the learning outcomes solely for the learners. Second, it is faculty-driven, in a way that it encourages faculty responsibility for teaching, assessing program outcomes, and motivating participation from the students. Third, it is meaningful. It provides data to guide teachers in making valid and continuing improvements in instruction and assessment activities. When we talk about outcomes, it means that it is the result of doing or learning in the process. We have two types of outcomes in education. These are immediate outcomes and deferred outcomes. Immediate outcomes are competencies or skills upon instruction, a subject, a grade level, a segment of the program, or the program itself. This is a type of outcome which is more specific as a result of doing a more specific process. An example of an immediate outcome is being able to solve a problem in physics after the discussion and continuous practice of solving problems. On the other hand, the deferred outcomes refer to the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective skills or competencies in various situations many years after completion of a degree program. Deferred outcomes are the result of doing things that involve longer and many process. An example of deferred outcome is being promoted from a job after 3 years of hard work. Benjamin Bloom, an educator, together with his colleagues in 1956, grouped the educational objectives into three domains. These are cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains. These three domains are adapted to develop the learner's 3H. These 3H are head, hand, and heart, which corresponds to each of the domain. Head for the cognitive domain, hand for the psychomotor domain, and heart for the affective domain. Cognitive domain focuses on learners' mental ability. It includes all of their knowledge that are processed on their brain. Psychomotor involves the skills of the learners, which involves their physical abilities. This enables them to perform or execute a task. Next is the affective domain. It involves enhancing students' emotional ability. It includes their attitudes and feelings that leads to a certain behavior. For your first activity, let us recall the hierarchy of learning for different domains. What you need to do is to give the missing categories for each domain of learning. You may pause this video to answer this activity. Now that you still remember the Bloom's taxonomy in the different domains, let's discuss every domains with its corresponding categories. Take a look at Bloom's taxonomy and its revised version by Anderson and Krathwohl. We can see the two major revisions that they did, which is making the noun into verb and rearrange the two upper categories. The first three categories, which are remembering, understanding, and applying, are under what we call lower order thinking skills or LUTs, while the upper three categories, namely analyzing, evaluating, and creating, fall under the higher order thinking skills or HATs. The LUTs are more attainable or easy to achieve than HATs, but we are encouraged to develop learning outcomes that is for the higher order thinking skills so that students will have stronger foundation with long-term learning. In remembering, it is recalling knowledge and use of memory to retrieve information that are previously learned. The examples of behavioral terms are know, identify, define, and memorize. An example of learning outcome is the student can identify the parts of a microscope. In understanding, it means that we are constructing meaning from the information we have acquired or experienced. Behavioral terms that can be used are interpret, exemplify, classify, and infer. For example, the student can explain briefly the continental drift theory. In applying, the learners carry out the learned knowledge. They could execute or implement using procedures. Outcome verbs that can be used in creating learning outcomes are execute, perform, and implement. For example, the student can demonstrate the basic functions of a microscope. In analyzing, students can break down concepts into chunks of information and use it to find relationships with other ideas. The outcome verbs that we can use are differentiate, organize, and categorize. For example, the student can organize the levels of biological organization from largest to smallest. In evaluating, students can make judgment based on given criteria and standards. Check and critique are some of the behavioral terms that we can use. For example, the student can evaluate the difference of abiotic and biotic factors. Creating is the highest category of cognitive domain, wherein it deals with making something out of a knowledge learned to form a coherent or functional whole. Outcome verbs that we can use are generating, planning, and producing. For example, the student can propose a set of alternatives for reducing dependence on fossil fuels that address both economic and environmental concerns. Now we're moving on to psychomotor domain. This domain uses R.H. Dave's model, which was developed in 1975. It has 5 categories where imitation is the lowest and naturalization is the highest. In imitation, it is observing the behavioral patterns of other people, and an example of a learning outcome from this is the student can replicate the step-by-step procedure in laboratory as executed by the teacher. The keywords that we can use in creating student learning outcomes are copy, follow, mimic, repeat, replicate, and reproduce. In manipulation, the second category in psychomotor domain is being able to perform certain actions by memory or following the instruction. The keywords that we can use are execute, perform, build. An example of a student learning outcome is the student can perform an experiment about volatility, viscosity, and density of water, diesel, and oil without assistance. The third category is precision. It is refining the skills to be able to be more exact. The keywords that we can use are master, perfect, precise. An example of student learning outcome in the science subject is the student can master using the compound microscope. The fourth category is articulation. It is adapt and integrate expertise to achieve harmony and consistency. In this part, students are able to perform the required task with mastery and consistency. The keywords that we can use are adapt, construct, combine, creates, and customize. The example of the student learning outcome is the student can combine a series of skills to meet the necessary requirements. And lastly, the highest category is the naturalization. This is where students have the skills and abilities that are perfect, refined, and flawless, which looks like it was natural for them to perform such tasks. An example of a student learning outcome in this level is the student can operate the different types of microscope with total accuracy. The keywords that we can use in creating student learning outcomes are create, operate, invent, manage, and design. Now we're going to the affective domain, where we will be dealing with the students' emotion, feelings, attitudes, and values. This educational domain consists of 5 categories, which are receiving, organizing, responding, valuing, and internalizing. The highest category is internalizing and the lowest is receiving. In the receiving category, we are developing students' awareness and become sensitive to something. In this category, we make students to be willing to listen and pay attention. Some of the outcome verbs that we can use in developing a learning outcome aligned to this category are select, follow, reply, and point to. An example of student learning outcome is the student can follow the hierarchy of biological organizations from smallest to the largest. The second category in this domain is responding. It is showing commitment to respond in some measure to the idea or phenomenon. Therefore, we let our students to respond on our question, or we let them clarify something about the lesson being discussed. Some outcome verbs in this category include answer, assist, comply, discuss, tell, and write. An example of student learning outcome is the student can write the reflection about the effects of increasing temperature and vegetations. The third category is valuing. It is showing willingness to be perceived as valuing or favoring certain ideas. In this category, we develop the student's attitudes and feelings towards the subject. Outcome verbs that are included are share, study, differentiate, perform, and propose. An example of student learning outcome is the students can share ideas in preserving the environment and maintain the biological balance. In organizing, it is arranging values into priorities, creating a unique value system by comparing, relating, and synthesizing values. The outcome verbs that we can use are arrange, combine, adhere, alter, defend, explain, formulate, and organize. Lastly, the highest category is internalizing. It is practicing value system that controls one's behavior. It is also known as characterization. Outcome verbs that we can use are act, influence, solve, and perform. The example of student learning outcome in this category is the students can influence other people to be more environmentally friendly and using sustainable and eco-friendly materials. Before we proceed, let us have another activity. Let us answer this question: why do we need to understand the hierarchy of learning? Students' learning outcomes are skills, competencies, and values that the learner should be able to demonstrate at the end of the subject or program. Achieving the learning outcomes are periodically assessed for 2 reasons. First is to know if the teaching strategy of the facilitator of learning is effective. Second, to know how much learning have been achieved by the students. That's why it is important that we orient students about the expected learning outcomes that they need to demonstrate after the lesson. This way, they can establish goals for themselves which help them to easily navigate their learnings. Bloom's taxonomy provides us a hierarchy as to what level of learning our students should demonstrate. Higher order thinking skills should be developed with a solid foundation on the lower order thinking skills. It is important to note that we need to start from the bottom of the hierarchy of learning and gradually increase it so that students can adjust properly. It is helpful since our basic education is a spiral curriculum where everything is repeated but with different level of difficulty with each grade levels. In writing students' learning outcomes, we should follow the mnemonics of SMART, which stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. Making a specific learning outcome will help our students to develop ideas, skills, and values easily. We should also avoid broad learning outcomes. The learning outcomes must be measurable so that we can ensure that it can be measured quantitatively using assessment tools or evaluation instrument. It is attainable. Attainable learning outcomes means that students will have an effective learning. They will be given activities that are suitable with their abilities. Therefore, when making learning outcomes for the beginners, we should avoid complex activities just to make that particular learning outcome included in the higher order thinking skills. It is realistic. Students should learn that what they will know in the classroom should be useful once they are already in the real world. Making realistic learning outcomes will help students create real-life decisions and output. Lastly is time-bound. Always determine your time frame, how long the lesson will run. Ensure that the set of objectives can be achieved within the allotted time. We should keep in mind that we must keep our learning outcomes within the allotted time, which is not lesser or not longer, since there were still learning competencies to be developed. Now that you are ready in creating student learning outcomes following the SMART mnemonics and Bloom's taxonomy of learning, there are some other things to keep in mind when writing these learning objectives. These are according to Navarro and de Guzman Santos. First, the institution's mission statement. Let us be aware that the student learning outcome should be aligned with the mission of the institution. For example, we are working with DepEd, so that we should make the learning outcomes aligned with the DepEd mission. The next one is policies on competencies and standards issued by the governing bodies such as TESDA, DepEd, and CHED. The third one is expected competencies identified by the different professional, business, and industry. Fourth one is the trust and development goals of the national government. And lastly, international trends and development where the learners are expected to be employed. This outcome will help students become globally competent and prepare them to the challenges brought by the 21st century. In outcome-based education, writing your learning outcomes should be student-centered. The teacher's strategy and teaching pedagogy will only serve as a guide in delivering instruction. A teacher is a facilitator of learning that has a broad and various technique that would aid him or her to let the learners achieve the set learning outcomes. Further, student learning outcomes are based on education regulating bodies, and the Enhanced Basic Education Curriculum of the Philippines have set of learning competencies that is to be achieved by the learners. This can be found on the curriculum guide issued by the Department of Education. Creating student learning outcome is one of the most important parts in assessment of learning 1. Guided by Bloom's taxonomy and hierarchy of learning, we can be able to devise SLOs that are SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. Most importantly, do not forget the curriculum guide, for we need it in creating assessment methods aligned with the competencies provided by the Department of Education. Thank you everyone. I hope you have been refreshed from this topic and keep safe. Once again, I am Earl Jordas Guevara, your reporter for today.